Her greatest wealth of experience and knowledge comes from her role of motherhood for the past 18 years. Amen? So we have someone, a very special guest, who is more than qualified to teach us about this topic. So I want you to welcome her together with a big round of applause as we welcome our guest speaker today.
Happy Sabbath, church. I am grateful to be here. Greetings from the Patchogue Seventh-day Adventist Church and our Adventist Youth Program. So I'm happy to come and talk to you guys about this. All right, so I'm going to open up with 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 7 through 8. Casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. So this topic is very close to my heart. It's what I do for a living. And I think that it's really important that we talk about it in church because we don't really talk about it enough. Okay? So let's talk about mental health. What would you guys say when I say something like mental health or mental wellness? What comes to your mind? Anybody? You can say the first thing that comes to your mind. Don't be shy. I'm sorry? Sanity, right? Okay. Anybody else? Mental health, mental wellness? Mental disorders. You said the brain. All right, good. So this is some good association. Mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. All right, but we're here for the youth, and it's especially important in our youth because this is really what sets the tone for the rest of our lives, right? So here I have a little chart that you probably can't see. Oh, you want to change it? Okay. Technical difficulties here.
Give me 1 second. Where is your icons?
Oh, you just gotta come out of this thing.
Okay, there you go. 1 second. Where is it? Display.
You can type it in.
Okay. This one here. I need to change the main display. Let's see if that works. Hold on, let's see. Oops. There we go. It's a little small. I'll adjust it from up there, okay?
Okay, thank you. All right, so back to mental health. I have a chart up here. Maybe you can see it, maybe you can't, but I will explain a little bit to you what is going on. On the blue, we have healthy. Yellow is reacting. Red, injured, or orange, injured, excuse me. And red, we have ill. So mental health or wellness is a spectrum. The way we think about it is you got regular people and then you got crazy people, right? That's not the case. Mental illness is a spectrum, and all throughout our lives, it can change depending on the environment, what's going on, maybe what happens when we're in utero, in our mother's stomachs, what happens when we come out, different traumas we might experience. So remember that it's a spectrum, and we can change all throughout life, right? So under healthy, you have normal fluctuations in mood. You take things in stride, good sense of humor, consistent performance, physically and socially active, confident in self and others, and In yellow, we have nervousness, irritability, sadness, being overwhelmed, displaced sarcasm, procrastination. And even if we go even further down to ill, we have excessive anxiety, panic attacks, easily enraged, aggressive, depressed mood, numb, inability to concentrate, bad sleep, can't fall asleep or you can't stay asleep, constant fatigue, illness, absence from social events or classes, and possibly suicidal thoughts, intent, and unusual sensory experiences. So now in the red, we're hearing some of the things that you do associate with mental disorders, right? But it is a spectrum. So when I talk about mental health, especially in churches, I want to mention the stigma that comes with it. I think in church, sometimes we feel like all of the stuff out there in the world is not in here, but it's important to know that everything out there is sitting in the pews with us every single day. And so we need to be prepared, and we need to be mindful, and we need to be educated, and we need to be merciful for all those who are sitting in the pews. We may not know what's going on with them, right? Another thing that I like to let people know is that symptoms are not a diagnosis, okay? So we all get anxious, right? We all get nervous. We all may get depressed. But the way that we in our profession decide if someone needs to be diagnosed will be their level of functioning. So yes, we can all be depressed. Sometimes we don't feel like getting out the bed. Sometimes we're down. But if you're missing days off of work and you're now threatened with losing your job, if you are a parent and you're not taking care of your children because you can't get out of bed and things are that bad for you, then your level of functioning is going down. If you're not bathing or taking care of yourself, washing properly, brushing your teeth, and people maybe notice. These are all levels of functioning going down, and that's when you start to meet criteria for a diagnosis. But it's important to understand that we all have these feelings so that we can relate to others, even though for us it may not get that bad, right? And then we have our baseline functioning, and that's a term that we use in the mental health field to denote where a person is usually, where their personality level is. Maybe a person is more excitable and they're more high energy, or maybe you are more of an introvert and you're kind of laid back and chill. So knowing where that is also a way to determine where you are on the mental health spectrum, okay? So I wanted to talk about some examples in the Bible of mental health, because I think that sometimes we don't understand that the two worlds collide, but they are all around us. So first things first, King Saul. You can read about specifically what I'm talking about in 1 Samuel chapter 18 through 21. Does anybody know what was going on with King Saul? Why I would have him as an example of mental wellness or not so mental wellness? Anybody? I heard over there first. He was depressed. Very nice. Evil spirit. He disobeyed God and consequences came as a result of that. Demonic delusion. Okay. Anybody else wanted to say anything? Okay, so with King Saul, we have jealousy, we have paranoia that the Bible talks about, depression, impulsive outbursts of anger, and music would help him cope. Music really would calm him and help him deal. I like King Saul as an example because King Saul, if you read his story, was not always like this. He was actually very on fire for God, and he lost his way along the way. So it's important to understand that not everybody is born a certain way, that things in life do happen that affect our mental health. And sometimes through sin and what some West Indians call bad mind. Anybody know what that is? Bad mind? Jealousy, envy, when you're plotting on somebody else, these types of things can suck you in. You know, this is why the commandment of thou shalt not covet and God's word can protect us from certain things. Because when you allow your mind to go down that path, it can lead you to where King Saul was led. He was so overcome with jealousy that instead of looking to God, he focused on trying to one up and kill David, and that ended up leading to his own death. Next, we have Elijah. Poor Elijah. Can anybody give me a little bit of a synopsis on why I have Elijah as an example? Panic mode. Mm-hmm. He got very depressed. So Elijah was not just being chased by just anybody. He was being chased by a really bad woman, Jezebel, right? The famous Jezebel. And Jezebel had a habit of, making things happen. If somebody, if excuse me, if her husband, King Ahab, was upset about something, that person disappeared and they weren't here anymore. And so Jezebel made good on her promises and she killed anybody who got in her way or upset her. So when she said she was going to kill you, she was going to kill you. So Elijah was very afraid and very spiritually, I feel like, wiped out. And he had thoughts of suicide. He asked for God to end his life. Right? So some of these things that we hear all the time, they're in the Bible. Does anybody know what God's response was to Elijah asking him to kill him? What was his response? How did God respond? Mhm. Very good. He let him know because Elijah felt like he was the only prophet of God left. So he felt very alone. That gives an idea to when somebody is having suicidal thoughts or ideations, they're feeling a sense of serious loneliness. And what God lets him know, you are not the only one left. Also, God does something very practical. He gives him something to eat. He gives him shade from the sun, and he says, take a rest, right? Gives him something to drink. So what does that tell you about how we should respond to folks who are having a hard time? Absolutely, we should meet their needs. Not listen, get up, let's go. Cut that out. You must not be praying enough. That's not how God responded. God himself didn't say, well, your faith is terrible. No, he gave him something to eat, something to drink, and he helped him, to take a moment. And then once he did that, he said, all right, let's move it along to what we're doing. So with Elijah, we have trauma, fear, experiencing violence and threats, depression, suicidal ideations, and coping through self-care. Next, we have Job, one of the most famous examples. Right? So Elijah, we see great coping skills and suicidal ideation. With Job, why am I using him as an example? Lost everything. Go ahead. He was super sad. Like, imagine all your children. Go ahead. That's right. He lost his children. He was very well off. He lost all of that. It was detrimental to him. That's right. So Job was going through all of this. He got physical illness. He lost everything he had. Even all his kids died in a horrible, terrible accident. And through all of this, what are his friends and his wife? What did they do? They accuse him of being sinful, and that's why he's in the position he's in. And his wife said, "Curse God and die." So what does this teach us? It's important who we have around us, okay? Support systems are really, really important. Think about who you've been in other people's lives when they've been really down. Have you been well, she was doing A, B, C, and D, so this is what happens when is that who you were? Or were you more like God that was compassionate and kind? This is why it's important to talk about these types of things in church, because we read about these characters and these people in the Bible, but we don't learn from it, because from what I hear, there's a lot of church trauma out there, and it's very sad, especially amongst Christians, because when people were going through really bad times, they were just like the people in Job. So we have extreme trauma, physical illness, major disasters, PTSD, lack of support, isolation, and extreme depression. And lastly, we have the demoniac, the man possessed by demons, and that was delivered by Jesus. Why do I have him as an example? He knew he needed help. He was demon possessed, right? Anybody else? Isolated. That's right. They kept him chained up because he hurt people, and he hurt himself. So self-injurious behavior, danger to self and others, perceptual disturbances, which basically means when you're seeing and you're hearing things, or things are going on in your mind that not everybody else is seeing or hearing. Issues with speech. He couldn't talk. Jesus heard him, but he couldn't talk. Only the demons could talk. And Jesus delivered him. Moving along, I have that same verse again: be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. And I also have Ephesians 6:12, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So here's where I talk about something that is probably the number one effect of mental health, and that's trauma. Now, they've done enough studies on trauma, and trauma actually changes the brain and the way the brain works. So, and a lot of people think, oh, you're born this way, but trauma actually, and specifically adverse childhood experiences, are the most correlated with mental health issues. So what do I mean when I say that? I mean, when people go through trauma in life, specifically in childhood, that means that they will more likely have a mental health issue, more than most other things, even genetics. So what's trauma? Yes. Mm. Yeah, that's an example of post-traumatic stress disorder. Mm-hmm. And you can feel like it's going to happen again. That's right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Very nice. Uh, hard to grow from, an experience that happens. So I'm going to give you guys some, oh, I'm sorry. That you are unable to cope with. Very good. So I'm going to give you an example of some of these adverse childhood experiences. And I'm focusing on childhood because that kind of sets the tone for the rest of a person's life. But trauma happens to people at any age. You can be traumatized, right? So we have divorce or parents breaking up, right? This may seem, and again, this is a rule, because just because you've gone through really horrible things, maybe you grew up in a war-torn country, so you come here and you're like, you're seeing people like, yeah, my parents got divorced, and you're like, we didn't have food to eat. Really? Like, you be all right. Your parents still love you. But trauma is trauma to whomever the person is. So the foundation of parents breaking up is huge for a child. And a lot of adults don't understand that, because experiences for kids are way bigger than they are for us as when we get this age, right? So divorce, a parent or a loved one in jail. Abuse, that's sexual, physical, verbal, emotional, and a big one people forget, neglect. Maybe you had a parent that did everything for you, fed you, all that, but you couldn't talk to them. It was like they were a robot. They never checked in with you. And there were things going on with you that you never shared with them, but that affects you. Bullying, which goes on a lot today, especially with you young folks in social media. I feel for you, because folks my age didn't have to go through that. When we left school, we left school. But unfortunately, social media kind of carries that on, right? Getting jumped, right? Fights in school, experiencing violence. Sometimes we think, oh, whatever. But experiencing violence is sometimes a terrible thing. And the violence is increasing and increasing and getting worse and worse. I'm sorry. Being in maybe your house caught on fire. I know a couple of people who have lost their home and all of their belongings to a house fire. Very traumatic. Living through war. Folks in Russia and Ukraine, the young people in Russia and Ukraine now will know the experience of living through war. And I know that's not something that we have here in America all of the time, but in a lot of other countries, different governments, things like that. I know my friends from Trinidad would often tell me about when the coup d'etat happened years ago there, and how they were literally just watching the news and folks came in and with guns and took over. And it's like, I can't even really fathom that or imagine that. But this happens all the time to people that live in other places. An absent parent, a parent that just wasn't there. These are all things that affect you. And these are different types of trauma. Also, death and addiction. Living with a parent that is on drugs or addicted to alcohol. These are all things that affect us. And so I put the Bible verses there because sometimes it's not as, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. To impress someone. And that's something that you remember, huh? That's one of my earliest memories, actually. I grew up in Brooklyn, and going to school, I was coming in as a kindergartner, and there was a huge fight. And that's one of my earliest memories, is that young boy bleeding. So these things put an impression in your mind, and seeing or experiencing violence is one of those things that is very traumatic. So I wanted to put this up because sometimes it's not as traumatic as the demoniac, the trauma in our life, or the we wrestling not against flesh and blood. Sometimes it's not that traumatic. Sometimes it's literally your family that is, not giving you what you need as a young person, right? Or being against you. Sometimes it's going to school and being surrounded by all of these different influences. Sometimes it's not as dramatic as the demoniac. It can be other things too. So we have to be very, very vigilant when it comes to our minds. It's really important. All right. So I will ask, when it comes to, well, first I'll tell you, comorbidity. When we talk about comorbidity, dual diagnosis, or co-occurring disorders, first, does anybody know what I'm talking about? When there's two diagnoses. Usually we're talking about substance abuse and mental health, but it can be medical as well, because most of the people that have, for example, an alcohol disorder, a lot of times they'll get things like pancreatitis, which is very, very painful. So that can be a co-occurring disorder. But often folks that maybe they have an opioid use disorder, they also have bipolar disorder. Right? So that's what co-occurring disorders are. But let me ask you this. What came first? What do you think came first? That's the famous question, the chicken or the egg. But what came first, the mental health or the substance use? Mental health, mental health. Everybody says, very good. 9 times out of 10, mental health did come first. And I don't want to say mental health as in that person had this mental health issue. The seeds and the soil that was ripe for a mental health issue to develop was most likely there first. Okay? You guys understand what I mean when I say that? Right? Not necessarily, oh, this person was born with bipolar disorder. They might have been born with a temperament and things happened and the right mixture of life happened where those things developed, right? So the other 1 time out of 10, alcohol use and certain drug use can lead to psychosis. Does anybody know what I mean when I say psychosis? Not balanced? Altered mental status? You said that? I'm not trying to. Go ahead. Disconnect from reality. That's pretty much the definition there. When you are disconnected from reality. So if someone is, maybe they're watching TV, this is an example, and they feel like the newscaster is speaking to them. And there's certain codes coming through. I know it's so funny, people laugh, but I work with these folks all the time. So, we have to be careful on the psych ward. We never put on the news. We try to never put on the news because even for sane people, the news is kind of triggering. So, they'll be watching the TV and they'll be thinking that the newscaster is giving them certain codes. And they believe that. So for a regular person, they're like, what are you talking about? The person is just giving you the news. So that person is disconnected from reality. Or maybe they're hearing certain noises or voices that are saying certain things. Other people don't hear it. So it's a disconnect from reality that other people share. But that 1 time out of 10, most of the time, mental illness comes first. But alcohol can lead you down the road to psychosis. Cocaine is like a number 1. If you do too much cocaine, can lead you to psychosis as well. All right. So the first group of drugs we're going to talk about is alcohol and benzodiazepines. Alcohol is legal. It's still very dangerous. And benzodiazepines, they kind of call the pill form of alcohol. Examples of benzos are Xanax, Klonopin. You guys have heard of like Xanny bars? Nobody? Good, I'm glad. But these are some things that are very around. They're very, very prevalent in rap songs. So these are the most dangerous to withdraw from. So when people want to stop using alcohol or stop taking benzodiazepines like Xanax or Klonopin or Ativan, they can die. So they come to the hospital to be assisted in that withdrawal. Other drugs, it may feel like you're going to die, but you're not actually going to. Alcohol and benzodiazepines can cause you to seize and die. So it's important to know, if you know anybody that is struggling with that and trying to stop. A lot of people feel like they got to do it cold turkey. It's good to encourage them, maybe go to the hospital, go to the emergency room. They know what to do there. Mhm. And the hospital will basically do that for you. But you also have the added support of being in a hospital. So if something happens, you know, they can really most likely help you better than if you're by yourself, right? So alcohol is really hard to deal with because it's legal, it's out there, it's very, very accessible. The pills are too, but very bad. Oh, and really quick, what type of drug is alcohol? No. Very good. Were you going to say, sir? Was that what you were going to say? Yes, alcohol is a depressant. Do I mean that it makes you depressed? What do I mean when I say depressant? What's it depressing? You're functioning. What is the thing that's slowing down the most? Alters your thinking, your brain, motor skills. So all of these are a part of our central nervous system, right? The brain is like the main station of our central nervous system, and it's made up of all the things that control a lot of what you guys said. So I don't mean, when I say it's a depressant, I don't mean it depresses you. I mean that it depresses the central nervous system, right? So here I have your brain, and I just am highlighting two parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for things like empathy, that's right up here, insight, response flexibility, emotion regulation, body regulation, morality, intuition, attuned communication, and fear modulation. So this is actually the part of the brain where you have a relationship with God. This is the part of your mind where you can pray and God can talk to you and the Holy Spirit can affect you, is the prefrontal cortex. This is also the part of you that's like, you know, realizes your inhibitions. And I know some people think inhibitions are bad, but inhibitions have their places. It will Alcohol will lower those things. So maybe you wouldn't normally act a certain way, but you drink some alcohol and you feel a little looser, right? You feel a little bit more relaxed. And that is where addiction can come in, because sometimes people have difficulties in social situations and they find a drug or alcohol and it helps them and kind of hooks them. So we have all of these functionings going on in the prefrontal cortex. And when you're taking a depressant, that's kind of turning off. You see response flexibility. When you play basketball, right, or sports, you watch these guys or girls and their responses is just crazy. It's like on the dime, and they have to be. That's why they're professionals and they get paid so much money, because they're so good. Their body can do that. When you're taking drugs or alcohol, especially depressants, you can't do that as fast. When you're driving, I know I have done certain reflexes while I'm driving, and before I could even catch up to know what I did, my body just did it. And my brain controlled that. When you're drinking or doing drugs, that's going to slow down that time, okay? The limbic part of our brain is the part that is what they would say a little lower thinking. It's the part that deals with fight, flight, freeze, our stress responses, emotions, and more emotions. So when we are depressing this part of the brain, who's going to start running the show? The limbic part of the brain is going to start running the show. And I don't know about you, but it's not a good thing for your emotions to run the show. If my emotions ran the show, I'd be in jail or dead. So it's very important. I don't know, maybe people can relate, maybe they can't, but it's very important for our prefrontal cortex to get in there and be like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we shouldn't do that. I know you feel really, really strongly about doing that, but perhaps we shouldn't do that. And drugs and alcohol really mess with that. And so for young people whose brains are still developing, and that number changes. They said 25, it's still developing. Now they say 30, it's still developing. So for young folks, when you are using drugs and alcohol, you are messing not only with these parts of the brain, but these parts of the brain that are still growing. Okay? And now opiates. Opiates is the drug of the day, whether you know or you don't. We have going on what we call an opiate crisis. I'm sure you've seen it on the news, maybe documentaries. Up there, you see, I have the poppy seed plants that grow in Africa, the Middle East, South America. These are the plants that you make opiates from. They were famously in The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy got sleepy. She was in the poppy fields. This here is heroin, and you can see it's in a powder form, and they liquefy it and take it intravenously. This here is oxys, famously blue pills. I have here this person here who's experiencing pain, because what do opiates treat? Pain. So it's very highly addictive, highly, highly addictive. And do we only have physical pain, or do we have other types of pain? That's right. We have emotional, mental types of pain. Yes. Right. And I have had opiate addicts tell me that when you do heroin, it feels like a giant hug. Right. So if you are going through a lot of trauma and you get your hands on some heroin finally, or it's usually a progression, and you finally get your hands on that, and it feels like a giant hug, it's going to be very hard to let go of, right? So opiates are a terrible, terrible thing. And the reason why there's an opiate epidemic is because a lot of doctors and medical professionals have not been responsible with prescribing pain medication. And many people, horrible accidents. This is stories that I've heard over and over. So it's not just, these bad people that just like to do drugs, they got strung out. Folks that had bad car accidents where they were, really messed up and were taking prescription painkillers for long amounts of time and got addicted before they realized. And then, on the street, can anybody guess what a oxy pill goes for? How much would you guess? No, not 500. 20, around 20. It's between $10 and $30 a pill. One pill. Yes, there's no deals. There's no deals. It's just one pill. So, and usually people who have an addiction, they're taking 5 to 10 pills a day. It gets expensive, right? How are you going to pay for that? And I'll let you guys use your imagination as to how people end up paying for it. That's when the legal system gets involved. That's when people start selling their bodies, right? And then that's when people go to heroin, because heroin is a lot cheaper. So that's really what happens with a lot of folks that are on heroin right now, is that they were addicted to prescription pain pills and it got away from them. And so they started using heroin because it was just much cheaper. And does anybody know how you feel when you stop taking opiates? How would you know? Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes people can get that bad. Not the withdrawal. From opiates, you can die. You feel like you can die. You can get very dehydrated, but it's like a very, they say, a super bad flu. Anybody had COVID? I had COVID. Did anybody have it bad? I had that Delta. It was bad. It was the sickest that I ever was. So that and what one of the worst parts for me was the aches. I had never really had a bad flu before. And I mean, like, my back, my legs, my wrists, all of these things were hurting. Also, opiate addicts get very sensitive to like light and things. So everything hurts. Everything hurts. And your pain tolerance is very skewed. So imagine you're an opiate addict and you get into a car accident and they have to do surgery on you. And your tolerance is really high. Yes, you can wake up doing surgery because they don't realize that you've been doing opiates. So, what a normal dosage would be for somebody, it's not going to be normal for you. So, it can be a very scary thing, but this is the drug of the day. And it's really important for you to stay away from it. I know me, I personally, if I'm in a situation where I'm in pain, I want to be able to take something and it work. So stay away from these types of things so that when someone actually does prescribe it to you and you actually need it, it can work for you, right? Let's see here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Pavlov's dogs. Has anybody ever heard of Pavlov's dogs? Classical conditioning? Okay. For those of you guys who have not heard it, Pavlov was a Russian scientist, and he was actually trying to discover why we salivated. He was studying that. But he discovered, basically behaviors and reactions and responses in the body through studying that. So what he did was he would feed this dog, right? And the salivation would happen. So he would have these things measuring the saliva, right? So then he would take something that had nothing to do with the food, which we call a neutral stimulus, like a bell. He actually tried many different things, but we'll just say the bell. He would ring it and feed the dog and measure the saliva. And then what did he take away? He took away the food and he just rang the bell. And what did he discover? The saliva. So this is something important to understand addiction, right? There are many different things that are going to be that neutral stimulus when you are using drugs or alcohol. So when you are trying to get away from it, it's very, very difficult. Very difficult. From driving down a certain type of street to being in a certain type of place to seeing a person, right? It's very important to understand that we condition our minds. And when you are dealing with addiction, you have to now uncondition your mind. And that is hard. It hurts. So before you get to that place, I hope you understand, young people especially, what addiction really is. And before you have to walk with what they say is a monkey on your back or a shackle, because for the rest of your life, it will be a shackle. You may overcome through God's grace, but for the rest of your life, you're susceptible to that, right? You don't want to have to walk around with that. So we have here methamphetamines and cocaine and marijuana. Does anybody know where cocaine comes from? Coca leaves, correct. Yes, they come from leaves that are located in South America, and folks that used to work in the mines and stuff on the mountains, they would chew them and it was kind of like a coffee effect. Today, they take coca leaves and they process them to make cocaine, which can also be processed further to make crack cocaine. Anybody familiar with the crack epidemic of the 80s? I'm a child of it, okay? Folks who were there, remember. Cocaine was a terrible, terrible thing back then. It has since dwindled off, but cocaine is still highly addictive and a huge cause of heart attacks. You don't really overdose from cocaine, but your heart can basically explode from using too much, okay? Methamphetamines. Now, marijuana I have on the other side there, that also comes from a plant. Methamphetamines doesn't come from anything natural. Methamphetamines, the base of it is a chemical found in cough syrup, and they add all sorts of things. If I sat here and told you all sorts of things that they find in meth labs, you wouldn't believe me, from roach spray to cat litter. These things they add in this, they cook them to create crystals in a chemical lab, and you smoke them, and you go very downhill very fast. It's not as prevalent here. It is prevalent amongst the LGBTQ community in the boroughs, and it's very prevalent in the Southwest. And now we have marijuana. Marijuana is probably the most controversial of all, because most people put it out there as the most harmless, right? So here's what I will say, speaking directly to my young people about marijuana. If anybody tells you that marijuana is the worst of the worst of the worst, that might not be totally true, because people can use it medicinally. If anybody tells you that it is perfectly harmless and nothing will happen to you, that is also not true. Okay? When it comes to us using things recreationally to dull our minds, there are consequences and repercussions of that in everything. Okay? So be wise. Be wise when you are looking at these things that are very prevalent. And I know you guys are around them all the time, because of the world that we live in. So be wise. Now we're going to move back, now that I've gone over some of that. What time? Where are we at for time? Okay. Now I'm going to talk to you about some specific mental health disorders, not all of them, but just some ones that you might have heard of. And schizophrenia. What do you guys know about schizophrenia? Anybody? Okay. Schizophrenia is what we call a thought disorder, right? Unlike a mood disorder. Oh, go ahead. Yes, sometimes you're thinking straight and sometimes you're out of your mind. With schizophrenia, you have bouts of psychosis, disorganization, delusions and hallucinations, and usually a person will need medication to function with this disorder and for the rest of their life, most likely. So I do have a video that I want to show you guys for just like a minute. And it's kind of spooky, but just so that you can understand a little bit of what it may be like. And this is, again, a little bit dramatic. Everybody is not going to be the same, but, just...
Worthless.
He's waking up now.
Oh, the phone woke him up. Don't answer. They'll know who you are.
You're a waste of space.
Why are you so stupid?
A waste of our time.
Stupid. So stupid. Worthless. We hate you.
He's gonna pick up the phone.
They'll know if you lie.
Rain. It's
Something
rain.
wrong. Weather.
Now to get pizza.
Poison.
Coming to you. Pizza.
He's hanging up.
Do you hear me?
Don't eat. Out to get you.
Poison.
They know about you.
Cameras
Poison.
rolling when the armed gunmen entered the convenience store on 14th Street. The suspects were described as medium in stature with a slightly youthful demeanor. Anyone with information about this incident is urged to contact
They
the
know.
authorities.
They know about you.
And in other news, officials have closed the northbound
Time for
lane
med,
on
don't
Oakwood
do
Boulevard
that.
due to a water main break. Repair crews are on the scene. Now here's a story out of Chicago from last night. Two men posing as maintenance workers nearly made it out of the Quick Bite convenience store with the store's ATM machine.
Make a
The
list.
suspects
Make
pulled
a
up the
longer
van,
list.
entered the store, asked the
You
customers
are
to not use the
ungrateful.
machine because of
You're a
the water
waste of
problem.
space,
They
a
told
waste
the
of our
clerk that they
time.
were going to take the machine back to their
Getting
shop.
coffee now.
Don't drink it.
Sensing something
Stupid.
suspicious,
So
the clerk
stupid.
That
called
smells
the local
awful.
authorities.
Don't drink that coffee.
When the clerk told the man he had called police, the pair took off and left the machine.
Why are you so worthless?
So, Sky, tell us how this weekend's weather is
Weather.
turning out.
Something wrong.
You know what, Chuck? There's just no stopping the weekend weather. You hear that, worthless? Weather's coming to get
Something wrong. Weather.
And what are you going to do about it, huh?
Something wrong. You have to stop it.
You're just going to sit around, your stupid mouth open and do nothing?
You have to stop it. It's the weather. It's here for us.
Now he has to answer the door.
It's here for us. Do something. Stay in.
Pizza!
Stay away from the
No,
door.
stop the weather. Protect us.
Pizza!
You didn't order anything.
All right. Just a little bit there for you to. So what does that look like? What is that like to even when I see your face? What is that? Huh? It's very scary. Say that one more time, sorry. Right. Absolutely. Sounds, somebody said confusing? Absolutely. So when I am, on the psych ward, we are usually able to see when a person is hearing voices. It's probably would be very easy for you to see. If somebody called me from over there right now, what would I do? I'm gonna go like this, right? Right. If someone starts talking to me from over here, I'm going to look, right? And you can usually see, we call it responding to internal stimuli. When you're talking to a person, I'll speak to them and they'll just be like, yeah. I'm asking them questions, and we call that thought blocking. And what's happening is there's a lot, as you can see from the video, there's a lot going on. And so for them, they're actually trying to cope with hearing all of this stuff and realizing that you don't hear it. And so they're trying to have the conversation with you, and you can tell what's going on with them. And, they'll be comfortable with telling you they hear voices, or they won't be comfortable with telling you that they hear voices. And unfortunately, a lot of times the voices are not saying great things to them. Sometimes we call them command auditory hallucinations. They're commanding them to do things like hurt people. And it gets so oppressive for them that they do it. You've even heard people say, I've had people check themselves into the hospital because they didn't want to hurt someone, because they felt so compelled to do it from the oppressive voices. So I just wanted for you guys to be able to see that and understand and be more compassionate for the folks who deal with that. So here you probably can't see, we have things like disorganized speech. Oh, where is it? Oh, there you go. No? There you go. Thank you. Thank you for the technical help. So here we have disorganized speech, catatonic behavior, lessened emotional expression. All of these are things that we look at, and symptoms that we look at to be able to tell us where a person is at mentally. And usually these things are tied into the diagnosis schizophrenia, okay? Now let's talk about bipolar disorder. And I'm sure you've heard people say, my gosh, they're so bipolar. What do people mean when they say that? That they're up and down, right? Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder. So it's not a thought disorder, it's a disorder of the mood. And we usually find out people are bipolar during the ages of 18 to 30. Oh, and going back to schizophrenia, sorry, I forgot to say this. That's also the age of onset. It's young adolescence into young adulthood. And so that's another reason why I am always telling young people to be careful with the marijuana, because I have had many people come into the psych ward, first year of college, they partied with their friends, and they had their first break. That's what we call their first psychotic break. And they are now diagnosed with schizophrenia or sometimes bipolar disorder. And sitting there and talking with a 19-year-old person and trying to get them to understand that they probably can't go back away to school. Their life probably is not going to be the same. They're going to need to stay with their parents forever, probably, because they can't really navigate the world themselves. It's very, very heartbreaking and very sad. Does that mean that marijuana causes schizophrenia or bipolar disorder? No. Trigger. Very good. Very, very good. So we have our genetics. We have things that are in our body that we may not know are there, right? People see that when sometimes people have babies and they don't look like anybody in the family, but that was a little recessive gene hanging out, chilling, that came to fruition. So you don't know all of the genes in your body and what may trigger that. And the marijuana of today is chemically engineered. So it's a lot stronger than just, oh, it grows out of the earth and we're just picking it and smoking it. And it's not that simple. So you don't know what's in your past or what's in your DNA or what's lying there that may come out. With bipolar disorder, age of onset is also in that range. And we usually find out when a person is manic. Does anybody know what manic is? Like a maniac. That's a good comparison. Yes. It doesn't necessarily have to be happiness, although a lot of people that are manic are pretty happy with that feeling. Mhm. Super high energy. Super high energy. Like sitting down and talking to a manic person makes you sleepy after. Some of the issues with we have elevated mood, irritable. So that's why I said it's not always happy. Sometimes they are high energy, but they are irritable, irritated. Loud, rapid speech, poor judgment. They can be vulgar. This is another thing too. A lot of times when people are manic, they will do things that they don't necessarily do. I worked with a young woman who became very promiscuous, and she was married, but she was manic. So it's another thing for me to say in church. We have to be very, very mindful. Sometimes things are going on we don't know about. And so we need to remember to be kind and non-judgmental and actually caring instead of, look at her. She a mess. She might be a mess, but she may be going through something that if she had your support and your resources of the community of the church, she would be able to get through it much better. So we have to remember that. Weight loss, grandiose delusions. Most of the manic folks that I deal with are writing books and they are rubbing elbows with famous people, and they're telling me that this is their best friend. P. Diddy knows them. They're going to see Barack Obama tomorrow. So very grandiose ideas. Oh, I'm a lawyer and I was in the military and I did this, that, or the third. And I'm like, okay. And huh? Most of the time they are not true. Most of the time they are not true. Sometimes people surprise you, but well, I have some stories. But oftentimes they're not true. They're not true. Who knows the number one thing that diagnoses someone being manic? Number one thing that we're going to look for. That's an important part of it. But the number one thing is sleep. When a person is manic, they don't need sleep. So these are signs you want to look out for. When a person is just going and going and going, and they're not tired. They're not like, oh, I didn't get to sleep. It's terrible. No, they are going. It's day 3 and they are, right? They have possibly inappropriate dress, flight of ideas. It's hard to have a conversation with a manic person. Like I said, it makes you sleepy. You're like, oh my gosh, I have to take a nap after talking to that person. And a big thing is poor judgment. Like I said about the promiscuity, but also there are people who come down off of that mania and realize that they took a second mortgage out on their house and they gambled all the money away. True stories, very true stories. So serious level of lack of functioning. These things happen. And so what's the other side of mania? Depression. And so when you crash and the added knowledge of what you just did while you were manic, you can imagine we have a lot of people trying to take their lives after things like this. So again, how you react to folks, like, you know, if you're concerned with someone in love, make sure they know you're concerned with someone in love and not judging them, because the depression side of it is really difficult for a lot of people. So the depression part, feelings of worthlessness, guilt, hopelessness, anger, irritability, loss of interest and pleasure, negative views, no appetite, insomnia, lack of libido, and suicidal preoccupation. So you see that middle line, that's where our baseline is going to be. And most of us are going to be a normal, have our ups and downs. Folks with mood disorders, they go really high and they also go really low. And sometimes they may need medication to help even that out. Okay. Anxiety and depression. Causes of depression can be genetics, brain chemistry, there can be an imbalance, poor nutrition, certain medications, chronic stress, low self-esteem or insecurity, drug abuse, because that's another important thing. When you're taking drugs consistently, it's hard for your mood to be level after that, and it's going to take some time for your baseline to return to what it was. Lack of social life, lack of sunlight, even hormonal changes. So a lot of people go through depression. A lot of people. You know, I had the examples of folks in the Bible, but every day, I mean, this is a world that is depression and anxiety inducing. And so it's important to check in on your fellow church folks, you know, when you're seeing things or people are going through stuff, really giving them encouragement, just a text during the week, calling and checking up on them, going over there, because it's important to have this community. Community is actually something that defends a person from depression. Folks that have community and go to church, well, community is one of the reasons that folks in church do better with mental health issues, because of the sense of community and the resources. But if it's not a sense of community, if it's not a safe space, it can make it even worse. Anxiety. Anxiety. Anybody know what anxiety is? Worry, fear. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Sometimes there's I'm sorry. And fear, absolutely. So sometimes there's a reason for us to be anxious, but when people are prone to anxiety, they will have the feeling of being anxious, not necessarily knowing why, or when there's no stimulus to be anxious. Has anybody ever gotten up late for work? They slept past their alarm and they jump up. That feeling? Instant anxiety. So imagine a person who deals with anxiety having that out of the blue. And a lot of times it's not out of the blue, but they're not necessarily acquainted with what their triggers are. So the work that therapists do with people who are suffering from anxiety is helping them to realize what triggers them. what things set off their anxiety, and then dealing and coping with that anxiety and helping themselves to come down. One thing that I do share with my patients is New Start. All the Adventists familiar with New Start, right? Good, good, good. So New Start, for those who are not familiar, is an acronym. And that means that the letters stand for something: nutrition, exercise, water. Go ahead. That's right. So nutrition, exercise, water, sunlight, temperance, which means balance, fresh air, rest, and trusting God. So all of those things I share with my patients, they absolutely love it. And it's what I call taking your medicine. It's another type of medicine. And we should all be taking that medicine. We should know that as Adventists, right? It's interesting to say, when I was in college, I took a sociology of religion class, and Adventism came up. I was very embarrassed though, because the professor asked, since he knew I was an Adventist, he was like, so what was the number one thing that propelled Adventism to become the global phenomenon that it is? And I didn't know. Shame. What does anybody know what it is? The health message. Our health message is what really made the Adventist church grow so quickly globally. And I don't know if you know that globally, we're a much bigger church than in America, right? We're growing in America, but globally, we're huge, right? Especially our medical facilities, right? So that was one of the biggest things in our health message, is a huge defense for mental health. For mental illness, right? So we need to really be proclaiming that health message and make sure that we're taking our medicine. Did you have something? Okay. Okay. So these things are important. The exercise, the nutrition. I tell my patients that are anxious, do 10 push-ups right now. Who can do 10 push-ups? You could do 10 push-ups, right? So if you're super angry or anxious, bust out 10 push-ups, 10 to 20, and then tell me how anxious or angry you are. You might still be angry or anxious, but your body will have to catch up. So some of these things can really help deal with, you go and do some boxing because you're having some anger issues or that anxiety, and it can really help. Right? And anxiety, important thing to remember, is manifested physically. So we can use physical ways to calm our anxiety, like deep breathing, prayer. A lot of people use meditation. Prayer is a great substitution for that. Things like exercise, grounding exercise, of being grounded and centered in your senses, realizing what's happening, what you're hearing, what you're listening to, focus. All of these different ways physically, we can help ourselves come down, since anxiety is manifested physically. And now I just want to again say, remember trauma. All right. Trauma, again, is most highly correlated with mental health issues. That means, as parents, if you're worried about your child's mental health, what's going to be more likely to affect them? Trauma, the way you're treating them, right? And a lot of us parents have our own trauma that we haven't dealt with yet. And that really, really makes it difficult to be a good parent. And that's just the truth. If you have issues with your emotions that you have not dealt with, you're not going to be available to your children in the way that they need you. And you're not going to be good at any relationship, sister, brother, spouse, none of that, if you haven't dealt with those things going on. So this is my shameless plug for therapy. As a therapist, I also do partake in therapy. And I think it's important to know that you can have Jesus as well as therapy. Jesus, God, his word is the biggest resource that we have. But we can also utilize the resource of therapy to learn things about ourselves that we didn't know. God gives us a lot of tools and resources to use. So really be open, especially as older folks, because you're the ones that are in charge of the younger folks. And a lot of their trauma comes from us, unfortunately. So we have to understand that. We have to become acquainted with that, accept it, and get healthy so we can promote healthiness amongst the youth, right? And be a safe space for them to come to. Because a lot of times we're just not a safe space as parents. So we can learn how to be safer spaces for them to be able to tell us all of the issues that they're going through, because man, they are going through a lot of issues, our young folks. All right. Unlike other forms of psychological disorders, the core issue in trauma is reality. Traumatic stress, the effects of overwhelming experience on the mind, body, and society, says it is indeed the truth of the traumatic experience that forms the center of its psychopathology. It is not a pathology of falsehood or displacement of meaning, but of history itself. So you're learning certain things in trauma that, from abuse, what do you learn? I'm worthless, that I'm not worthy of love, that no one's ever going to care about me, that I deserve this, that the reason why these bad things are happening to me is my fault. And even though we get older and we are intellectuals and we learn certain things, deep down inside, we take that with us. Someone's been bullying us for how we look or the color of our skin or for how we talk or whatever, and those things stay with us. So it's important to remember this and to allow our young people to have that safe space. Any questions, or does anybody want to share?
I love you mentioned that we are Jesus. See, Jesus cast out the demons from a man who was possessed with contamination. I've seen somebody by who said me again, and they wanted to lock up this person behind bars for 120 days. And you left us alone. And I said to them, no, not good. You take the person to church, pray over them, and pray over them. And once now this person have a job, and they do the job, and the person is just hand over. Take it to the Lord in prayer. We look at Job, we look at Elijah. Job never lose focus on God. But Elijah allowed the church of Jezebel to fear him, to protect him, and he forget about everything else and think about self. I am the only one. Jezebel gave him, she said, I might if I don't come to heaven. But already 2 days passed. Wait for you running, wish in adultery. We lose sight of us.
Absolutely, but it's absolutely, but we have to remember that this world is very, very threatening, and it's very difficult. So while you're absolutely, our faith needs to grow, but even Paul was calling for Timothy to come visit him because he was down, he was scared, and he was wiped out. You see a lot of examples of where we got down, and I spoke about Elijah, and I said it was an important thing of how God responded to Elijah wanting to kill himself. He didn't respond with saying, why are you not paying attention to me? He didn't respond that way. He gave him something to eat, he gave him something to drink, and he let him rest. So he was compassionate to that. Sometimes we're going to get down, and we cannot fall into the trap of thinking that the devil won't use our emotions, that we won't get depressed. Oh, well, I'm not a good Christian if I get depressed, or I'm not a good Christian if I'm down. I must not believe in God. We will be tried. And while we need to understand and have the foundation that Jesus is always there, and yes, that will save us, we can understand that it's okay when we're affected by our very human emotions. Absolutely. I'm sorry, you had. I'll come right back to you.
A lot of young adults, like when you're a young adult and you have certain things that would cause you to want to go see a therapist, many times in the church, you're told, oh, it's because you're not praying enough, or if you were close to God, then this, you wouldn't be having those concerns. Something that's always interesting is that we see that in church, people, all of us, were at different places in our journey, right? So we also know that when someone has mental health issue or mental wellness issue, it also has to do with the person feeling isolated or probably lonely. But you talk about in terms of communities, if that community isn't there, what's most needed for that person is to have someone to speak to one-to-one. Meaning somebody that you can potentially see and have a conversation with. And I know in many cases, the church is not, most churches or most church people are often not in support of that. And I think it's very detrimental because I think suicide rates and constant depression and things of that nature happens as a result of the young adult trying to conform to what the church believes as opposed to getting the help that they actually need. And
Absolutely.
that's why it's very important also when it comes to leaderships, that if you know that someone is having, or you see that someone is acting a little different, it's all right to be different, but to the point where you're concerned, okay, why is this person always isolated? So I need to talk to the person because that level of separation from the rest of the crowd, it's not okay for someone to be that way. It is okay for people to deal with things how they deal with it, but on a consistent basis, if you're seeing that this is a regular behavior for someone, not always turn an eye away from it.
No, absolutely. Or look down on
Or
it.
look down on it, or tell the parent of the child, oh, it's all right, just pray for them, it's gonna be better. Sometimes that's not, it's not enough.
Well, it's not practical because what does Jesus do? Jesus is our intercessor, right? Because we cannot save ourselves. Sometimes people can't pray for themselves. Sometimes they are at a point so low where they can't pray and they need people to come over them and pray for them, right? So it's not just to say you're not doing enough. No, sometimes we need to really actually be like Jesus and be that intercessor for them and come around them and really support them because they can't do it for themselves. You had something to say?
I've been studying quite some time about mental health and other things. I'm into more into neurology study, okay, of the serotonin, melatonin, and the dopamine. I was hoping you bring that subject up because it is the main root of the answer to all these kind of mental dysfunctions and all that. Then again, there is this antithesis crisis that's going on, okay? And the dysfunctional, I was studying this week about dysfunctional and Jacob found and all that. And in that sense was because lack of knowledge and understanding about the study that we need to catch up with. So, I've been working with my grandchildren, and maybe coming future, as soon as I told them about the studies about what is melatonin and serotonin and dopamine, and how they affect themselves by eating wrong things. And also, with my daughter-in-law who takes medication. Pharmaceutical medication, believe me, not only the drugs and the streets is the only danger that's around us, it's also the pharmaceuticals, okay? So if you are a patient that takes over 18 types of prescriptions, suppose there is a war that breaks out. All these other pharmacies are closed down. Right there, you have death row, because you need to either withdraw the symptoms of the pills to cut it down or you're taking, or you need to it, it's not there and that's it. I mean, I have a nurse practitioner right now. I have someone who is fourth stage cancer right now, and he's seeing all the medication. I said, listen, man, you're more in danger than the people on the street, which is right. We get locked up, and I've seen them, they have, that's experience like after people.
It's a hard thing to navigate, to be able to decide.
And they live I'm glad that you came up with these other things about personhood and symptom pregnant and all that. Okay, I agree that a lot of that's going on because they require a need of the medication, but that's because they have not studied about what it is. If they get to study about it, because I did work with a therapist before, and he was bipolar. And I said, I told him that did you want to study about what bipolar is before you just took the pill when the doctor told you? You know, he goes like this and thinking, that's a good point. I should have studied about what it is. When they tell you, a doctor tell you, you want to be this, or you want to be that. You might want to go to hit that library and start reading books. Okay? Because it's a key and to your serotonin. Because serotonin is a neurotransmitter your body that needs. If you feed it, if you nourish it right away, then you're not going to end up in these kind of.
Okay. Well, it's important to understand it is hard to navigate, and that those things are very true. We should study more about that. But when you are at the level of functioning where you already have schizophrenia, where the symptoms, because medications treat symptoms, not necessarily whole diagnoses, when you're already at the point where these symptoms are debilitating to your life, then oftentimes we do have to come with psychiatric medications. But I think that, like I was saying with the health message, along with studying about what types of things to eat and how they help your brain and what our brains need is very important for those of us who are functioning well now to continue our optimal functioning. You had some.
We have to remember that emotions are not a bad thing. We have to just put our emotions subject to Christ and the Holy Spirit. If you follow the example of Jesus allowed his emotions to react to certain things, but not to be able to control. He knew that he could raise Lazarus from the dead, call for Lazarus to be raised from the dead, but he still cried for him. Christ knew that God was raising from the dead, but he still said, Lord, if you could let this pass from me. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was so depressed, and he begged the disciples, come and pray with me. He knew that he was raised from the dead, but still the emotions were there because it's part of our human nature. But what we just need to learn to do is ask God to help us to put all these natural parts of our being into his subjection, and also to put the right people in our way in order to help us to deal with these things. Scripture says, iron sharpening iron. It says that if you love your brother, you will cover your brother. It says that love covers a multitude of sins. It also says that we have to be our brother's keeper. So we have to be actively involved in each other's well-being, while at the same time knowing that we are all putting our well-being in Christ's hand and Christ's will.
Very true. You wanted to say?
Oh, sorry. The question I want to ask you said it that you hinted earlier about us as a church. How can we be supportive of individuals that are going through that? I like you said that, like if the person, we don't know if they're praying for themselves or can pray for themselves, like to pray for Natalie. This is Natalie. She has children and they're misbehaving in church. Like, call my name out in prayer. But on a real, what can we do to support what's going on here? Because I don't know what's going on with my church members. I think they're doing well, but that could be a lie. Not in a rude way. But I want to, and I hope to, that this is my family. If my family is hurting, I want to not know they're hurting, if that makes sense, but to give support to their hurt.
Well, you have to be a safe space, and you have to establish a relationship with someone to be able to have any sort of say in their lives. So if you don't talk to the person and you hi and by happy Sabbath, God loves you, and that's the deepest your relationship goes, why would they tell you that they're thinking about killing themselves? I mean, that's just, why would somebody go that deep? So we have to establish real relationships with one another. And you have to be a person where they can not only in front of your face, but they can observe that you actually care. You actually care, right? Somebody else. I'll come to you right after. Oh no, her first. In the there is a way out. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a good thing. Can you take your, I'm sorry. Well, I'm not a psychologist. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. That's okay. But you mean how do I explain it to people? Okay, so you're meaning if I think what you're saying correctly is how I apply some of the things that I'm teaching. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think it's for the stigma to go. Well, we have to educate, of course, self-educate, right? We have to look more into some of these things. That's why I brought up some of the things with bipolar disorder, and promiscuity, also with trauma. When young people are sexually molested or abused, promiscuity is something that you might see. So how do we react to promiscuity? That should be a red flag, right? So it's a re-education, right? I think a lot of times our traditional church selves are like, we want to look down at it. Instead of understanding that when you see a behavior, myself in the world that I'm in, when I see a behavior, I know that it's indicative of something else underlying that. So I'm not just looking, well, he or she is a mess, or they're fast, or they're bad. No, there's a reason why they're doing what they're doing. And if I care, I'm going to actually approach this person. And hopefully, I already have established a relationship with them. And I think that's the right place for it, re educating ourselves and understanding why certain things happen. I think that in our, traditionally and older generations, we just paint things a certain way. We have to re-educate ourselves, and we really need to listen to young people because a lot of what they have to say makes so much sense, and we need to forget a lot of what we have learned and grew up with. Back there, and then I got you.
don't pay attention, and be patient with you, A lot of times that's like a barrier, that's why a lot of, young people don't feel comfortable going to their elders, tell them what they're going on. Because we don't, a lot of us don't, create the environment for that. We constantly create the environment, feel comfortable in those and not judgmental when you do it, I know, that's why I have to create.
We have to intercede. I'll get you right after her.
I'm wondering if there is if there is a go-to website, personal office, is there, I know you have on the live connection with the conference, but everything that's going on, is there an office or some place to reach out, people within our congregation, people within our family is having some issue and would like to reach out?
I'm not sure through the conference. I would say there are tons of crisis numbers now for mental health issues. And I believe one of my slides has them somewhere. But I can share that with you. These are things you can definitely Google. You can go to if someone's having suicidal thoughts or ideations. There are crisis numbers for that. Really quickly though, I don't know, but I don't think so. I'm not sure for crisis. I know we have Family Life, because actually Pastor Smith is our pastor. Okay. But I don't think we have a crisis center, that we can go to for crisis and mental health issues, things like that. We should, absolutely. From my experience, yes. I could sit down with every single person. And I mean, when you look at statistics, like 1 in every 3 to 4 women will be sexually assaulted by the time they're 18. That's just true. And I don't care what group of women you get around, whether it's here in church, whether it's at work, or whether it's wherever. And, if you're surprised by hearing this, understand that what I'm saying is true, absolute truth. A good amount of the women that you are around have been sexually assaulted, period. That's just one statistic. We don't really know the statistics on young men, but we know young men experience violence at super high rates, especially if you're growing up here in New York City, right? So my thing would be, yeah, I think it would be a safer bet to bet on, yes, that's true, than no, from my experience. Yes, at some point in our lives, we're going to. If something happens at home, somebody gets divorced, things like that, be proactive. Sit down and talk with a child. People think a kid is 4 or 5 years old. Oh, well, they're just whatever. Sit down and say, what do you think about what's going on? Are there a lot of things happening right now that are confusing you? And hear what they have to say. Even at that young age, they have things to say. And some of the most fascinating conversations I've ever had have been with 3 and 4-year-olds. So talk with them. As adults, we ignore them. We think that they're just extensions of us. They're little people that are growing up, and we have to respect that. Absolutely. And also share your testimony with the young folks. And I mean, not the PC testimony. Share the dirty with the youth. Share where you've been. Yes. Share where you've been and where you've gone to and where God has brought you. because they don't think that you can relate to any of the stuff that they go through or any of the things they see or hear. They don't know that these things, there's nothing new under the sun, and these things have been around. So share your testimony with the youth. Absolutely, and that's another reason why people may want to come to a therapist rather than someone in the church, because by law, we have to keep things confidential, and we don't understand or respect that. I'm going to give it back to Andrew. Thank you so much. You've been amazing.
Wow. Fantastic presentation. What do you guys think? Did you learn a lot? We want to thank you again, Sister Cristina. Let's put our hands together one last time. That was very informative and very practical, a very good amount of practical tips and advice that we can apply in our lives. And I think that one of the key takeaways is that we are a church family. The key word is family. And as she said, you have to have those real connections. So it's not just a word, it's a reality. We have to treat each other as family in order to be there for each other. Amen. Let's get ready to collect offering as we get ready to close. Clive, why don't you come down? And we got the baskets right here. We want to collect offering for our youth ministry. Anything that's collected today will go directly toward our youth department so that we can continue to put together an amazing year for you guys. So we want you to dive deeper in your pockets, deeper than you ever have before, and so we can raise funds for our youth ministry. Let's just play some music in the background as we collect this offering.